A short while ago, 4 years ago, apparently? Yeesh. I made a very, very long video discussing the disparity between the presence, characterization, and treatment of toms and she-cats in Warriors. If that's a topic that interests you, I'd point you towards that original video, as I won't be going over those arguments again here. However, in the years that have gone by, a lot of new Warriors content has been released, and I've had a lot more time to think about the material, which has brought up a number of realizations that I'd like to discuss here. Consider this a shorter video, a state of the Warriors, if you will, rather than a complete sequel. The original Gender in Warriors video went over a wide variety of topics, but the one I'm focused on today is the statistical analysis. Specifically, line counts, as they are both the thing I received the most common counterarguments to, and the thing that needed the most updating, considering the 4 new years of content to cover. If you didn't watch or don't remember that first video, line counts are a measure of how much every character speaks in every book of the series, counting both voiced dialogue and intentionally italicized thoughts. It takes roughly 3 hours to line count an average Warriors book, and it's a very tedious process. But recently, I had some time to sit down with the last many books they've released and knock them all out in the space of a week. I didn't originally intend on doing this for a video at all, but simply because I enjoy having the perspective it can give. Once this whole line count spreadsheet was created, though, I realized I finally had the opportunity to address a couple of common concerns brought up in the gender video, otherwise known as the last time I heavily referenced the spreadsheet. The first of these arguments is that, since that video, we have had 2 arcs with 2 she-cat protagonists and 1 tom, rather than the other way around. A Starless Clan had Sunbeam and Frostdawn, and Changing Skies has Tawny Pelt and Moonpaw, as well as Leafstar for the first book. Perhaps, with these new female protagonists, we finally tip the gender scale towards equality. A second, and almost as common argument I've heard, is that these statistics weren't fair in the first place because, for instance, if Firestar is the only protagonist for all of the first arc, then of course Toms will get the most lines because he got the most lines. If there are more Tom protagonists in the Super Editions, of course there will be more Tom lines across the Super Editions, and so on. Even beyond those 2 arguments, I realized in looking through my new data that trends were emerging in the modern list of books that bothered me even more than the gender disparity I'd previously discussed. So with all of this together, I knew it was time for a quick data review. Since the gender video came out, these are all of the books that have been released. There's a lot, but as far as the new things I line counted, we had a full and a half main arc, the final 2 full-length mangas, and 4 super editions. Across those, we had 2 she-cat points of view in a Starless Clan, 3 in Changing Skies, 1 from a Thief and Thunder Clan, and 2 from Ivypool's Heart and Storm Clan's Folly. We can quibble over individual portrayals of these characters, but it is an objective fact that being a or the point of view character in a book is going to get you a lot of lines, usually around 500 to 1400 depending on which type of book you're in and whether or not you're the only point of view. That has to count for something. All of the new main series entries have been teetering around a 50% she-cat to tom cast ratio, and she-cats have had anywhere from 49% to 66% of the lines. That's firmly in a rough equality zone. However, on the Super Edition side, while we have casts filled with 42% to 48% she-cats, those she-cats get line percentages anywhere from 79% in Ivypool's Heart to 19% in One Star's Confession. The question becomes, does one of those win out over the other? On the whole, has the series tipped more towards equal percentages in the last few years? This is where I turn to my full series statistics. Using all of the individual line counts, I created tables to show the percentage of she-cat characters and percentage of she-cat lines for every arc, as well as every type of supplemental material, and the total across the full series. In 2022, when I made that original gender video, here's how those statistics would have looked. You'll note that most percentages are in the 40s, there's exactly 1 case where lines tip in the she-cat favor with the new prophecy, and a couple of points are in the 30s, or, in the case of the original arc in Dawn of the Clans, even the 20s. Overall, 45.10% of the cast in the series is she-cats, and those she-cats get 42.24% of the lines. It's definitely possible for these statistics to look worse, but there is clearly an overall slant towards toms, with only 1 arc where the she-cats are more favorably looked upon instead. Now, in 2026, here's what those same statistics look like. Of course, the first 7 arcs of stats, as well as the guides and novellas, remain the same, but the latest 2 arcs both have significantly above average percentages of she-cat lines, which is great to see as a balancer. In A Starless Clan especially, even the cast is composed of more she-cats than toms overall. Unfortunately, the Super Edition stats actually went down in she-cat line percentages, even though they went up in she-cat cast members, and the mangas went down significantly in both, despite one of the 2 mangas being she-cat led. The total stats went from a 45.10% she-cat cast to a 45.13% she-cat cast, barely a noticeable difference, and from 42.24% she-cat lines to 43.49% she-cat lines, which is more encouraging. It may be slight, but at least in some ways, the past 4 years seem to have improved overall she-cat prominence in the series. With that being said, do you remember the common argument I brought up earlier about Tom POVs skewing the number of lines Toms get? It's a fair argument, as point-of-view characters in a book get a pretty massive percentage of the lines, though the exact amount depends on the specific book. Firestar got 3,274 lines across the original arc. Jayfeather got 1,890 across Omen of the Stars alone, and Brambleclaw took home 1,213 lines in just his Super Edition. These sorts of numbers are bound to affect the results in some way. Now, I would just make an addendum that across the current main series, we have 14 Tom protagonists and 14 she-cat protagonists, and the numbers are still skewed in the Tom's favor. And even in something like the Super Editions, where the divide of 12 Tom protagonists and only 8 she-cat protagonists makes a line imbalance inevitable, it's still an issue overall that the series chooses to make more books about Toms than she-cats by default. However, I still think it's worthwhile to see what the lines would look like if these staggering point-of-view totals weren't involved. How does Warrior spend time on its support and minor casts, and are there any trends we can see there? In order to determine this, I went through every arc, Super Edition, novella, and manga, and individually cut out any lines from characters who were, at the time, point-of-view characters. This meant that someone like Bristlefrost got no lines added to the total of the Broken Code, since she was a point-of-view character in all 6 books. But Clear Sky, for example, only had his lines removed in books 3 through 6 of his arc, since he wasn't a point-of-view for the first 2 books. And someone like Stormfur only got his total removed for Moonrise, the one book he spent as a point-of-view character. After all of these deletions were complete, I also removed any characters who now had 0 lines from the arc or even series totals, to make sure the cast percentages weren't impacted by characters we'd effectively removed. This left me with this table, and I'll put it beside the original 2026 version for you to compare. You can see immediately that the total she-cat cast percentage and the she-cat line percentage are almost equal now, which is great. But what I find especially interesting are how the individual arc and supplemental material stats have changed. Considering we only removed 1 to 4 characters per arc, the cast percentages haven't changed very much, but the line percentages have moved closer to the center. Of 45%, not 50%. There are no more 57% or 24% she-cat totals, but instead 2 51% totals and 4 percentages in the 30s. Moreover, the 2 arcs that manage that above-average number of she-cat lines are A Starless Clan, which makes sense considering a major she-cat was acting in an antagonist or eventual support role in all 3 points of view, and Dawn of the Clans, which was previously one of the worst performing arcs for she-cats. When you remove the 3 central Toms, a lot of the Dawn of the Clans cast is fairly balanced, and the she-cats even have relatively prominent and varied support roles. But the issues with that arc come more from the roles those she-cats get, and how we're supposed to sympathize with the Toms as she-cats in the background are going through far worse crises. It's also worth noting that when we removed all of those Tom-heavy points of view, the Super Edition she-cat line percentages did go up, but only to the series-wide average of 45%. And even with the new she-cat-led manga, the overall she-cat manga line percentage drops sharply, from 41.74% to 32.84%. The novellas also go down quite a bit if you were wondering. All of this may seem like relatively minor shifts, and when it comes down to percentages, small changes of 10% or less can feel insignificant. Alternatively, you might feel like a series-wide average of 45% she-cats and she-cat lines is fine, as we shouldn't be shooting for exactly 50% in the first place. But keep in mind that we're working with numbers significantly larger than that 100 that the percent system is built on. Warriors has a total of 1,252 speaking characters and 169,751 lines now. 45% of the cast being she-cats means that there are 116 fewer she-cat characters than toms, and 43% of the lines coming from she-cats means that the toms have 23,603 more lines than the she-cats do. As we reach numbers this large, in a society that produces, on average, equal numbers of each gender, the percentages should be much closer to 50%, and certainly not in the 30s for any one gender. Warriors has improved over the last few years, and it's true that the statistics are slightly better when we discount the lines of our protagonists. But it is a fact that, on average, Warriors uses and focuses on more tom characters than they do she-cats, and it will take a lot more than Frostdawn or Moonpaw or Ivypool to make more sweeping changes to these statistics. Having said all of that, though, I actually don't believe that line counts, or statistics in general, do or should count for everything. It's why that wasn't the only thing I covered in my original video. They're useful for making trends concretely visible and crystallizing hunches we may develop as we're reading a story, but they don't tell us about the reasons that data comes to be, or the more specific differences in the writing of different books or eras of books. The statistics can tell us that the first arc is severely lacking in she-cats or lines for them, but it can't tell us that the reason for that discrepancy is because support and minor characters were assumed to be toms by default, and being a she-cat was a noteworthy characteristic that put most of those characters into more prominent support roles. Statistics can tell us that the Broken Code doesn't devote much of its time to the she-cat characters that they included, but it can't tell us about the growing trend across that arc of major and minor characters' relationships consistently emphasizing the presence, characterization, and arc of the tom over the she-cat. In fact, statistics would grade the last 5 arcs of the series very differently from each other, and can't point out the pattern that has plagued our protagonist relationships from Dawn of the Clans to A Starless Clan. We'll see how Changing Skies fares there. In a number of ways, Warriors has been improving, at least slightly, in gender equality on a statistical level over the last few years. However, the real revelation I came away with when I finished these statistics had nothing to do with gender at all, and instead helps to explain why so many of the recent books and entire arcs have failed to grip me. It's no secret at this point that what I appreciate most in Warriors, or books in general, is a rich and connected cast. Even if we don't see Running Wind or Spiderleg or Snowtuft or Gullswoop often, it's nice to know who they are and see them act consistently in the background to cement that this is a world our protagonists live in, rather than a world built around the protagonists. This is something the series has almost always struggled with to varying degrees, but has certainly been feeling worse lately, and in these line counts, I've found part of the reason why. Cycling through now are the statistics for each arc that show how many of their lines come from just the point of view characters, as well as the percentages of cats in the cast that have 5 or less, 10 or less, 50 or more, and 100 or more lines across the book or arc. This doesn't say everything because, for example, one line could be an impassioned speech about your values, or a random cat in the crowd saying "yeah" or "no" to fill space or provide necessary opposition to our protagonists. However, it's generally been the case since the new team took over that the cats with only a few lines in a book aren't treated as their own characters with consistent lives, personalities, relationships, or values, but rather as vessels for what the plot needs them to be. So it's worth saying that over the last 4 arcs, there has only been one book to have less than 80% of its cast get 10 or fewer lines. A Light in the Mist, thanks to its ample cameos from old heroes and villains in the Dark Forest. This means that the vast majority of characters you meet in these modern books may be ones that you never or rarely see again. Even within an arc, let's say A Starless Clan, it is common to have minor characters like Plumstone, or hypothetically important support characters like Owlnose or Icewing, get 1 to 2 books to have a larger smattering of lines and be completely absent in every other book. This makes it extremely difficult for the reader to even tell which characters are intended to be important. So if, completely hypothetically, you were trying to set up 2 characters as the rightful leader and deputy at the end of a long, mystery-filled arc, it would be very difficult for a reader to tell that based on how the author seemed to have only remembered their existence for 1 book before the finale. But even for our protagonists, the characters we have to assume the authors care about, once their arcs are over, they often disappear into the ether as well. Violet Shine had 10 total lines across both A Starless Clan and Changing Skies. Nightheart has spoken once in this arc, despite being the father of Moonpaw's boyfriend and the mate to her mentor. These are unthinkable numbers when comparing them to older protagonists like Firestar, Squirrelstar, or Jayfeather. There are some possible explanations for this. First of all, the new team has consistently been doing something with their main arcs that wasn't done in Vicky's era, placing all of the protagonists in different clans. This, combined with the fact that those clans are much larger thanks to the lack of death and need for legacy kits, means that we enter each arc with 3 massive casts, all in different places. So perhaps it was deemed impossible to keep up with all of these cats, and authors instead placed their focus solely on the main characters and any immediately relevant support characters. However, this same trend of ignoring the background cast also appeared in StormClan's Folly, a book with a single cast and an increasingly small one as the book went on, and one where fleshing out the background cast, or at least stating who was there, was important for the story. Maybe then this is just a difference in writing style between the Vicky era and the new team. After all, the first arc has an extremely strong support cast, and most characters brought up are given a specific purpose in the narrative and line counts to match that. The new Prophecy and Power of Three weren't far behind, despite the expanding focus on other clans and cats outside them, and even Omen of the Stars kept its 10-line character count under 50%. But if this was just a case where the new team wasn't sure how to manage a cast like Vicky did, I wouldn't expect them to be getting progressively worse with every arc, and many super editions. Fewer and fewer cats besides the protagonists have even gotten 100 lines as time has gone on, and the books themselves are getting shorter and more clipped to the key plot beats, with very little intentional build-up or time with consistent support characters. There's also, notably, an example of an arc not made in the Vicky era that covered multiple clans and still had an incredibly strong and consistent support cast: Dawn of the Clans. By my statistics, and depending on what metrics you give more weight to, this is either the arc with the strongest or second strongest support cast in the series, only rivaled by the original arc. Vicky was still around to advise when it was being produced, but Dawn of the Clans was mainly a new team invention. And though there is much to criticize it for, it has an undoubtedly strong command of its characters and their roles in the world. Characters who are there with the traveling group or already in the forest each have consistent presence, personalities, and relationships across the books. Characters who are brought back later continue off their previous characterization and history with other characters, and all of the characters have personalities designed to drive the plot forward, rather than having the plot decide their personalities. In that case, why is this something the new team has never since replicated? Well, that's something we can really only speculate on, but I think it may have to do with the specific cast they were using. The 2 best arcs in terms of the presence of their support casts, the original arc and Dawn of the Clans, both invented the entirety of their casts for the stories they were telling. They could design and care about each cat individually as they chose to include them in the books. As time has gone on, more and more cats have been added to the main timeline, and the new team had to essentially adopt 4, then 5, massive existing clans that they had no stakes in. A new protagonist team is picked out for each arc for them to care about for a while, and in any given book, they'll pick out a few names from the allegiances to involve as minor characters, but the cast as a whole still remains blank, and we certainly can't expect them to maintain any characteristics they invent on a whim across different books at this point. This is part of why I wish they would just throw us into a new time period for a whole arc, or more, again, to give the new team time to actually build and attach to an, ideally smaller, cast of characters. Dawn of the Clans really didn't sell well in comparison to other arcs, so I highly doubt they ever would, but I can dream. Of course, we also have situations like StormClan's Folly, showing us that even new time periods don't force you to use the opportunities you have to build your cast. Maybe that's why the book's misuse of its characters was so jarring. It isn't unique in its ignoring the entire cast beyond the main characters, but it's the first time that methodology has been applied to a brand new time period and cast that could have been designed with the story in mind. If they don't jump to a new period or kill off a lot of the clans en masse, then to fix this mounting issue, they're going to have to change how they approach their casts. The Warriors world is big, and for the readers, or the authors, to get a sense of what the world is like, they're going to need to choose a consistent few to focus on, who are close to the protagonists, or make an effort to attach themselves to all the minor characters they want to use in order to make them consistent. Currently, they've chosen neither option, leaving us with no consistent or existent relationships for our protagonists, and a broader cast that we can barely remember exists. Honestly, for me, that's a larger problem right now than anything to do with gender. Thank you for watching, and always remember that Twig Stem? Whatever her name was. Remember, she was a protagonist once, and I'm sure that makes her very important.